Hi, my name is Corie Whalen, and I'm on the board of directors for an organization called the Coalition to Reduce Spending. And I'm here today with my friend Felicia Cravens, who is the president of the Houston Tea Party Society. And we are here today to discuss the impact of our mounting federal debt and what we can do to prevent that from getting worse and to hopefully make it a little better, and to discuss what the main drivers of our fast approaching $16 trillion national debt is. So it's a very dire situation that we feel needs to be discussed. And the Coalition to Reduce Spending is an organization that is dedicated specifically to figuring out ways to tackle our massive national debt. And what we try to do is advocate for balanced budgets and hold politicians accountable to their word through our Reject the Debt Spending Pledge program. So today we're here to discuss that matter, and I have Felicia with me because she is an expert on topics like this. And we're going to discuss a little bit about what some of the trouble with our current system is and what we can do as activists and citizens concerned about the matter. So just a few things before we get into a conversation. I want to talk about the fact that our national debt, like I said, is fast approaching $16 trillion. That's a massive, massive number. We're at the point where our debt per citizen of this country is about $50,000, and the debt per taxpayer is $140,000. So that's really, really massive when you think about dividing it up between every person in this country. And essentially, you know, at the Coalition to Reduce Spending, we believe that tackling our national debt is really the issue of our generation at this point, because it's impacting future prosperity. And people have a lot of different opinions on how to best reduce the debt. We've looked at the math, and we tend to see that really the only way to do this is to reduce federal spending. And so with that, I'd like to just put a few more facts out there. During 2011, the federal government brought in $2.3 trillion in taxes while spending $3.6 trillion. That means that there was a deficit that year of nearly $1.3 trillion, and these mounting deficits are what contribute to our $16 trillion national debt now. The other problem is that spending across all levels of government now totals 40% of our gross domestic product, and our debt to GDP ratio exceeds 100%. That means our gross domestic product being really in the aggregate every single thing produced in this country. Our national debt exceeds that, and our spending is 40% of it. So that's a huge problem. It speaks to how unsustainable this issue is. We believe at the Coalition to Reduce Spending that this is a bipartisan problem, because if you look from 1954 to 2010, Republicans controlled the White House for 34 years and Democrats for 22. And Democrats controlled Congress for 44 years and the Republicans for 12. And our long-standing spending spree really has been enabled by both of them. So we believe it's time for the citizens to take control and really get educated on this issue. And so without further ado, I'll introduce Felicia Cravens. Like I said, Felicia is with the Houston Tea Party Society, and she's done a lot of work on this issue too and has some Texas perspective as well. So Felicia.
Glad to be here. I'm interested, too, the way that you phrase things about the gross domestic product. All the things we make in this country, all the stuff we have, if you sold it, even at the best prices, you could not pay off this debt. And people don't grasp that. And it's time they do. I'm so glad that you're going to be focusing on this, because we can talk all day about this bill or that bill, but this is a systemic problem. You're right.
Right. No, that's absolutely true. And one of the things I did is I highly, highly suggest that people go to usdebtclock.org. That's usdebtclock.org. It's a ticker of all sorts of, debt and liability issues that we have in this country. And one of the things that really strikes me is if you scroll down to the bottom of this clock, you can see that we have 120 trillion, I can't even say it, it's such a ridiculous number, 120 trillion in unfunded liabilities. This comes from Social Security, a prescription drug liability, and a Medicare liability. When you add up total small business assets, corporation assets, and household assets in this whole country, there's $92 trillion, meaning the political promises that our politicians made just to benefit themselves and maybe allegedly to help people. I do believe that they want to help, but unfortunately they didn't do the math right, and they can't keep these promises, and people who are dependent are going to end up hurt, and this is a really worrisome thing. And I think there's a lot of political demagoguing going on where when people say, oh, those are looking for reform are the ones who want to hurt. Well, I'm not entirely sure that's true. When you look at the numbers, doing nothing is what's really going to hurt people, and we're very concerned about that at the Coalition to Reduce Spending.
When you have a bad tooth, you don't leave it in your mouth and hope that it's going to get better. You have the tooth out. There's loss there, and it's painful, but it's healthy in the long run. If you leave an infected tooth or an infected gums in your mouth, you're going to become very sick, if not dead. So stopping problems while they're small is always a better philosophy. This is the same sort of thing. When you're looking at this, the things that were promised to people with good intentions or not, doesn't even matter. The intentions don't matter anymore. We're looking at the results. Promises they didn't intend to keep for political gain or whatever. There's a time of reckoning. There always is. You can only kick the can down the road so far. At some point, you have to pay, whether it's, you know, from your mouth getting infected and you having to lose all your teeth, or whether it's from your nation being unable to pay its debts and then being beholden to whomever holds that debt as well.
Right.
Those are problems.
That's another scary thing is the fact that so much of what we spend currently is borrowed. And another thing that this usdebtclock.org addresses is our borrowing. And that's a really, really scary thing too, is how much we borrow and the interest owed in our debt. Did you actually know that the net interest on our debt, when you count the main drivers of our debt, the number one is Medicare and Medicaid, number two is Social Security, number three is our defense and our wars, number four is income security, be that unemployment, forms of welfare and assistance, number five is the interest on our debt. That's really, really scary because that's going to be worse and worse, and a lot of that has to do with our borrowing. And number six is federal pensions. Again, that goes along with nice political promises that sound great but really aren't sustainable. So these are the main drivers of our debt, and the political will to address them kind of seems to be lacking, which is what the Coalition to Reduce Spending is trying to address through our different programs, which we'll talk about a little more. But I want to talk a little bit more about how damaging this is. And Felicia, I know you have some thoughts too on how this also impacts the various states and their budgets, not just the federal government. You know, it trickles down. So what do you have to say about that?
Well, first of all, notice that list that you gave. 4 out of 6 of those items are direct payments to people in one form or another. So the government's buying something with these payments, whether it's you know, some sort of peace of mind for people, or whether it's votes. Different people, you could make those cases. But payments to people are a huge thing, and this is why that's a problem. Used to be in societies in the United States, when there were problems and people were hurting or injured or needed help, the community did it. The community took care of them, and they said, I need to do something about that, because it was personal.
And they saw it. They saw it happening in their own backyard.
Yes. Now what's going on is that we've been socialized into someone needs to do something about that. And so they've taken their hands and their obligation from their heart off of it completely.
Tragedy of the commons, right? Oh, someone else will do it.
Someone will do it, preferably with maybe a couple of bucks out of my pocket, but a whole bunch more out of his. That is what culturally we're looking at, which is why this is bigger than a political issue. It really is. It's a heart change of the whole nation. It's a values change. But when you're looking at what this does to the states in general, obviously the country was set up in order to have laboratories of ideas around the country, different ideas tried different ways. They're moving so much to a nationalist model where one size fits all in all the applications of these programs. So what ends up happening, the states have to jump through hoops in order to obtain federal dollars. And now they're excited to obtain federal dollars instead of leery and hands off and wanting to handle things themselves. This filters down, for instance, in mortgages. You have all of the mortgage rescue programs at the federal level that they've been trying to do in order to prop up the housing market. Well, why would that be? Because most state and municipal governments have some form of property tax as funding. So when foreclosures happen and banks sit there with that on their balance sheets and they can't get rid of them, who's paying that property tax? So of course, the federal government giving money to banks to pay keeps the states and the municipalities afloat.
I know. And what's scary is that I think people tend to forget that at the end of the day, the money the federal government spends, the tax money that they take in, which, by the way, federal tax revenue, according to U.S. debt clock, appears to be at about $2 trillion, which we're spending much, much more than that, right? So that's one of the problems is, even assuming that the federal government wasn't overspending, I think, like you're talking about, cultural problems here. I think culturally we forget as a nation that it's not free money when the federal government gives it back to the states, right? It's not like, oh, wow, they're gifting us something. Actually, what's happening is we're giving them our money, and then they're taking overhead for all of the bureaucracy.
Yes.
And then they're giving it back to us, and somehow that's a gift when actually what happened is there was a net loss for the taxpayers and the state. So it's one of those things where we've just completely forgotten where our money comes from, and we tend to think that the federal government propping up the states is somehow a gift to the states, which in reality it's more like chains than a gift. And it's a scary thought when you realize that most people aren't thinking about that at all.
Even if the federal money came right back. The state money went to the federal level,
no overhead,
and then came right back. No, I mean, with the normal operation of business,
right.
The overhead itself between the different agencies in which it filters down through takes so much of it.
I know.
And think about this too. When you realize what an average federal employee gets in terms of wages and benefits, and what an average private sector salaried person gets in terms of wage and benefits, I did some rough math. It's 20 to 25 people in the private sector that supports every federal person on average.
Wow.
It's something like that.
Yeah.
And where's the hiring been going over the past few decades? Into the public sector, into the federal sector.
That's very
unsustainable too.
It is, it is. It appears that we have a caller, so I'm going to go see what somebody has to say. Hello?
Yes, ma'am.
Hi.
Hi, I have a couple questions and comments, but
Sure.
I'd also like to know what nights are y'all going to be on, and are you going to be on Thursday nights from now on? And it's good to see some different other points of view besides what you regularly see on TV. And the comment I wanted to make is, I think it's cool what y'all are talking about. A lot of people expect things from the government or entitlements, think it's free, and it's not free.
Yeah.
It has to come from taxes and other things.
You're absolutely right. And that's one of the problems that we're identifying is, it's really easy for politicians from all parties to just say, oh, yeah, I'll promise you this, I'll promise you that. And they're buying votes with our money. They're buying our votes with our money. And it's a scary thing when you think about how little money there actually is at the end of the day. So thank you for your comment. And no, we won't be on all the time. I'm guest hosting today, but thank you for that.
I want to ask one more thing.
Absolutely.
I think that's the lady to your, I guess she'd be to your left on the TV to your right. She's with the Houston Tea Party?
Yes.
Yes, Felicia.
Okay, just out of curiosity, a lot of times you see, I don't understand why the Republicans and the Tea Party people don't point out things or talk about things like the Obamacare. Obama says he's for the poor people and the middle class people, but what those people aren't thinking about is at the end of the year, 2014, if that Obamacare comes into point, half those people can't even, a lot of people are having trouble paying rent, paying bills, and barely getting by. So when it comes to the mandatory insurance things, if those people don't have insurance, they'll be penalized at the end of the year.
Absolutely.
And I don't see how they can. It's just not talked about. You would think they would. I mean, that's just pretty much common sense. You can barely afford your rent and afford to feed your family and take care of your family. How are you going to be able to afford insurance at the end of the year?
Absolutely. Well, let me answer that a little bit, because Obamacare is still one of the issues that is #1 in terms of motivating Tea Party people, Republicans right now. This election has been about the Obamacare plan, about the implementation of the plan, about stopping the plan. Those organizations, whether here, nationally, other states, they're focused on that issue, absolutely. A lot of people still don't understand all the parts of it. And it takes a lot of explaining. That bill was huge. The application of it, you know, this is one of the bills that we had to pass it to know what was in it, according to Nancy Pelosi, to find out how it's going to work. This is that thing. There are so much application of it. We're still learning how it's supposed to work. Now, that said, there are a lot of people that are still working on that. It has been an issue in this campaign. It will continue to be an issue in this campaign.
Yeah, because
Keep watching.
That's just common sense. I mean, you can barely afford to pay your rent.
Right. Yes.
How are you going to be able to afford insurance? And then at the end of the year, you're going to be penalized, and that's going to even put you more in debt.
Right.
And as far as the Nancy Pelosi thing, that's kind of like her saying, "Let's just pass the bill, and we'll worry about what's in it later."
Yep.
That's like going somewhere and signing a contract somewhere and say,
Yes.
"Oh, don't worry about what's in it. You can just read that later after you sign the contract."
Right, and you can sue the people that you sign the.
Common sense.
You can sue
You
the
would
people
think,
that you
right?
sign the
Yeah.
contract with if they hide stuff in the contract, or, you know, in the word it differently. You can't sue the government. That's a problem.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your call, and you know,
And keep up the good work.
Well, thank you. We really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Ladies, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. How
Yeah.
sweet.
That was a great call, and I think he makes a really good point that you look at our federal spending, and allegedly it's supposed to help people, but he brings up the concern of middle-class families trying to support themselves not being able to. And guess what? He's right. They're not helped by a penalty. They're not helped by these unfunded liabilities. And you know what scares me almost the most, especially as someone who's young? You know, I'm 25. A lot of my peers are unemployed or living at home.
Right.
One of the things that really scares me is when you look at debt, one of the things that happens is inflation. And if you look at the price of basic goods, they've been steadily going up. When the price of food goes up, the price of gas is complicated, but sometimes it relates to inflation. When the cost of these basic goods go up, the politicians don't feel it. They have cushy jobs. They've got all kinds of lobbyist money. They're fine. You know who feels it? The guy who is struggling to pay his rent, like the people that this man mentioned. That's who hurts when the cost of goods increase.
And look at what happens specifically with Obamacare and this mandate of buying insurance. If you don't have insurance because there's not a plan that works for you or something like that, or your insurance company your employer dropped in insurance because of the cost of business that it increases. What happens to this person is now their mortgage is no longer their first item on their budget. Their food is no longer their first item on their budget. Their electric bill is no longer the first item. It's a payment to an insurance company. And that ruins the entire structure of their personal budget.
It does. And what's scary, too, about the politics of it is that, and again, this is bipartisan. Of course, you have, you know, Republicans who tend to talk a big game when Democrats are in office, right? But this happens under them, too. But one of the problems you're seeing, especially in the current campaign, is you have people saying, oh, well, let's just raise taxes on the rich. That sounds great politically, right? It's kind of like what you were talking about. Like, oh, yeah, the rich, that's fine. And that's great. That makes for great politics. It makes for great political theater. But one of the things I wanted to bring up, and one of the reasons the Coalition to Reduce Spending exists, is because mathematically, no matter how much utopian politics you want to talk, mathematically, taxing the rich, even at 100%, would not even make a dent in our national debt. And I want to bring up a study that was published in April of 2011 by the Wall Street Journal. You can find the piece by Googling Wall Street Journal Review and Outlook, where the tax money is, April 2011. And I just want to read from this for a second. What was written was, consider the Internal Revenue Services, IRS's, income tax statistics for 2008, which at that time was the latest year for which the data was available. The top 1% of taxpayers, being those with salaries, dividends, and capital gains roughly above $380,000, paid 38% of the taxes. Assume that tax policy confiscated all the taxable income of all the millionaires and billionaires. That yields merely $938 billion, which is sand on the beach amid the $4 trillion White House budget, a $1.65 trillion deficit, and spending at 25% as a share of the economy, which is a post-World War II record. So basically, all these political promises about, oh yeah, we'll just tax the rich, that sounds great, and it might get a couple of politicians elected, but it's also how we got to the point where our unfunded liabilities are more than our national assets. So that's why we need to talk about this issue, because...
And look, economics is not the study of numbers like this.
Right.
Economics is the study of what real people do in real situations. And real millionaires who get real money confiscated from them, you can do it once, you'll never be able to do it again.
All the people in France are leaving. Have you been reading about that?
75% tax rate in France. They are scooting out of that country pretty quickly.
That's
Absolutely.
the problem. Again, it sounds great, right? You say, oh, well, we'll tax all the millionaires and billionaires, but millionaires and billionaires are obviously resourceful people if they became
They're much more flexible in times like this.
Exactly. So they can up and leave, whereas the guy trying to pay his rent, he's stuck to where he is supporting his family. And guess what? The price of goods go up, all the unfunded liabilities make his life difficult, and all the millionaires and billionaires leave because they can't live their lives. And why would they? Why would they live where they're being confiscated? Mm-hmm. So it's just very scary, you know. I think a lot of these ideas about government being able to support everybody don't take into account that people have free will. You know, they can leave if they don't like it. So it's very scary. And
the more that this economy starts pressing down on people,
yeah.
the less mobility they have. They're tied to a house, they're tied to car payments, they're tied to obligations at home and all over the place in their neighborhoods, things that they're indebted to that they can't move from.
Right.
You can't even hire a moving truck if you can't make your other payments.
Yeah.
You're stuck.
No, it's very scary. And just something I want to bring up for people interested in learning more about why reducing spending is truly the only mathematically feasible option. If you go to reducespending.org/learn, you can look at all sorts of resources that we've compiled, similar to this Wall Street Journal study, that really show simply how crazy this situation is, and also that shows you different resources of various budgets that have been proposed in Washington by all sorts of politicians to show you certain paths to balancing the budget, how those are feasible, and what we can really do to put a stop to this, because it's not going to happen overnight. You know, politics is the art of taking things slow. You know, I believe you were saying before, Felicia, that if you and I, people like you and I, got what we wanted overnight, it would be a shock to the system.
Absolutely.
You know, these things have to happen over time, but the problem is a shock to the system is going to occur if we don't deal with this.
Exactly.
We need to find some kind of middle ground and come to a compromise about how we really address this problem.
We'd like to choose the manner of the system shock, a gradual shock that you get a little bit at a time, and one that you're managing, one that you actually have some control over, or the one where things collapse and things fall down around you and you have no idea what happened or what to do.
Right. No, it's very, very concerning that if we stay on the current path, these programs that the government has made people dependent on. I mean, for example, look at Social Security. That's not a program you can opt in or out of. You know, I'm paying, I believe it's 30% of my income to Social Security, and personally, I don't think that program is going to be around by the time I'm that age. Like I mentioned before, I'm 25, but I pay a significant chunk of my income to support a program that doesn't even demographically make sense anymore. You know, my generation, there's a lot less of us than there are baby boomers, and we're struggling economically because there are no jobs for us, yet we're expected to support a generation that not only has more money than us, there's a generational wealth gap, by the way. So the older generations have more than us, and they expect my generation to somehow pay for them, even though there's so few of us compared to them. So just everything is on its face, and I feel like
and wait, stop. Park on that, because culturally, I'm a boomer. I'm not a boomer. I'm sorry. Where in the world did I get that? I'm a Gen Xer. My generation has always grown up, and I've had this discussion with plenty of friends. My generation has grown up believing this is not going to be there, that Social Security is not going to be something.
Imagine how my generation feels.
So imagine, yes, you know, your prime working years, they're going to be trying to figure out how the system works for someone like me. It won't be there.
I know.
So, and I understand, again, promises people didn't intend to keep, but people paid into the system mandatorily. They could not opt out, and they had no option to get out of it, and they listened to politicians who promised that they would save it. That said, there's a lot of talk politically right now about different plans to save it, but this candidate versus that candidate. All those are wonderful things to attempt to do, again, to keep the system from being shocked. You can't turn it off. But new solutions require that this model that they have now has to be destroyed.
I know.
Has to, in some form.
And it's very scary to me from someone from my age bracket when I hear politicians saying, we can't change anything about it ever. Well, do you not understand what that means to my generation? And I understand that my generation, you know, isn't necessarily as politically engaged as older generations, but this whole generational gap in wealth is very, very scary. And I read an interesting article at Reason magazine where they had a graph showing the literal generational gap in wealth. And you know, people talk a lot about class warfare, but I really think it's generational warfare in terms of what's going on here. And that's one of the reasons that I'm involved with the Coalition to Reduce Spending. It's all the people who founded this organization are under 30. And the reason we're doing this is because we're trying to speak to our generation and say, wake up, you're the ones being kind of hosed by this.
Absolutely hosed.
So it's a concern. It's a pretty major concern. And
I gotta say, I gotta stop here and park on this too.
Definitely.
Isn't it wonderful that there are people who are under 30 who are interested in these issues and doing something about it now, before or maybe even during their young children, you know, young childbearing years, young child rearing years, because it takes those people as well. Their voices have to be heard because they're the ones who are going to bear this burden far out into the future. As life expectancy goes on for the boomers, as they demand more medical services, as the Gen Xers start to get into retirement, it's squarely on your shoulders, your generation's shoulders. And it's wonderful that there are avenues like this for younger, informed voters and activists to be involved in the conversation, and not in a sort of pat you on the head sort of way, but doing real, serious work.
Right, exactly. And that's one of the reasons the Coalition to Reduce Spending is hoping to kind of come up with our own budget plan too. Like I said, we have the resources listed of current plans. We're still a newer organization, but we really want to craft a plan that highlights how it's going to impact younger generations. We do a lot of resource sharing with groups such as Bankrupting America. That's a good one to look up on Google. Learn Liberty is another really good resource too. I mean, there are lots of really cool organizations who are, you know, creating great videos and resources and really harnessing technology to talk about these issues and reach the youth. Because at the end of the day, that's what my generation needs to understand. Is it might be, you know, cool to vote a certain way or to vote for certain candidates from a pop culture standpoint, but we need to drill down and look at who's promising what and use a little bit of the math skills we were allegedly taught in school. And it's not that hard. Math was never my best subject in school, but I can go to usdebtclock.org and I can see that the number 120 is bigger than the number 92, right? So it's just really scary, and people need to be aware of these numbers and not just blindly trust what the politicians say, because at the end of the day, they're out for their own power. And people need to realize that it's not about them, it's kind of about what they do in D.C.
And you make a good point about the video idea. Right here, we're sitting with a bunch of papers in front of us, and some people's eyes would glaze over at that. Some of us wonkier people can sit and look at this all day. But, you know, Reason TV has great videos. Like you said, Learn Liberty, those things. There are fabulous resources, even some humorous, silly ones like House of Sunny, just YouTube channels that are great starts for people who know nothing about economics, finances. They may have passed a few tests or took it in their high school years, and that's the last they ever saw of it. It's important to know education in economics and economic literacy is crucial to getting out of this, because otherwise someone will be able to spin you and manipulate you with any chart, any graph, anything. You need to know the basics.
You do, absolutely, 100%. And yeah, you mentioned Reason TV. I would highly suggest anyone who's interested in kind of the pop culture angle on this to go to YouTube and Google Reason TV, the name Remy, R-E-M-Y.
Yes,
He's a rapper. Go Remy. He's a rapper. And he raps about all sorts of different things, but he actually, some of the things he raps about are economic issues. And he has the funniest video. If you Google Go Remy, raise the debt ceiling. Best video ever, I'm just telling you. This is how you, this is one way to reach the youth, through humor and through culture that they identify with. So that being said, I want to move the discussion a little bit more toward, we talked pretty extensively about the extent of the problem. But of course, we need to talk about potential solutions as well. And as you well know, Felicia, this is not going to happen overnight, but we do need to start using some mechanisms and really putting the pressure on politicians and holding them accountable. And that's where the hallmark project of the Coalition to Reduce Spending comes in. We have a pledge we've crafted called the Reject the Debt Pledge. And we've had over 20 candidates for federal office sign it in the past 2 months or so, because we are a fairly new organization. Texas-wise, we had both Ted Cruz and David Dewhurst, when they were in their runoff, sign this pledge. We had Jessica Puente Bradshaw, who is she's a candidate who won her runoff down in the South Texas area near McAllen down there. So Jessica has signed the pledge. We also had Wes Riddle. He lost his runoff to Roger Williams, but he signed it as well. And those are our Texas candidates thus far. But we're always looking for more. If you have a federal candidate you think should sign, and this is totally nonpartisan. We want all candidates to get on board with this. But certainly go to reducespending.org and you'll see the link where you can suggest that a candidate sign this. Briefly, our Reject the Debt Spending Pledge has 3 planks. Essentially, the first plank is that the politician will not vote for any budget that's not balanced, that doesn't have a path to balance. We understand that it's not going to happen overnight, but they won't vote for any budget that does not eventually show a means of balance. And they won't vote for any appropriations bills that increase total spending. The second plank is that they'll consider all federal spending open for reduction. You know, politicians love their sacred cows, but we need to sit down and look at everything and have this discussion. And along with that goes the fact that if you're going to authorize or fund new programs, you have to offset cuts in other programs. So we're trying to at least, you know, stop the bleeding, essentially.
Yes.
And 3, you know, just don't arbitrarily increase borrowing or the debt ceiling. Again, if there's a budget that requires some increases to the debt ceiling over time, okay, we understand it's not going to happen overnight, but we can't keep increasing it without any path toward a balanced budget, or else we're going to just simply drive off the fiscal cliff, and that will hurt everybody. It will hurt those dependent on government the most, the ones who people with good hearts may have voted for politicians that said they were going to help those people, but those people are now in the most danger due to those very politicians. So our Reject the Debt Pledge is basically, you know, lays out what we think is good policy to work toward. And like I said, we were very fortunate to have our pledge become essentially part of the debate between Ted Cruz and David Dewhurst. And we had a op-ed in the Daily Caller, which is a popular online website, and we titled it "Ted Cruz and Other Candidates Redefine Fiscal Responsibility," and you can find that entire article on our website at reducespending.org if you're curious more about the Texas angle on this. But essentially, this is what we're doing as a means to try to hold politicians to their promises. And Felicia, as someone who's been involved with the Tea Party, you know what it's like to have politicians, you know, make promises in primaries and then kind of go to D.C. and forget about what they said to the grassroots. And so what we're hoping with this Reject the Debt Pledge, we're hoping obviously for it to become more institutionalized over, you know, multiple election cycles. But we want to give activists something to point to when that politician comes back home and you say, well, you told me you weren't going to increase the debt ceiling. In the past, that was all just rhetoric. They could kind of spin it, say, oh, no, I didn't exactly say that. If they signed this pledge, you can wave that right in front of them and you can say, I think actually this is your promise. So it's a tool for activists, and it's also a tool to move the direction of the discussion in the right manner in D.C. So that's
we get
what
the
we're
government
going
we
for.
expect.
Yeah.
And then we get the government that we look for and that we hold accountable.
Right.
And so as much involvement as we can have in something that's so succinctly packaged, where you can say, step 1, this is it. Don't vote for budgets that aren't balanced. It's very easy to explain that to
Right,
anyone.
it is.
It's clear, plain language. And it's not got wiggle room in it. It doesn't. And that's where you can, where any activist can say, did you vote for a budget that actually wasn't balanced?
I know.
It's very simple. Activists have the hardest time having these discussions with politicians because politicians tend to talk way around them in circles and talk about these grand, great, big things that are going on. Did you vote for a budget that was balanced?
Right.
It brings it back to elemental level, and that is so key for an activist to know how to do.
Yeah, and that's what we were trying to do, is we were really, at the end of the day, this is a tool for activists. And also, you know, we see it as being specifically a great, great tool in primaries. And I think that the Ted Cruz-David Dewhurst dichotomy really speaks to that. Because, you know, Ted Cruz signed the pledge, and David Dewhurst shortly after said, oh, I'd like to sign this pledge. And that's great, because it pushes both candidates in the direction of talking about this issue. And in primaries, that's when, you know, as you know, Felicia, that's when the politicians are really having these discussions with the base of voters that is the most active. And they make a lot of great promises, but this is simple. Like you said, it brings it back to the most basic level, and that's what we're looking for. And when a politician breaks this pledge, it also can be a tool for a challenger to that politician. Say somebody wants to mount a primary challenge against a politician who lied to activists. They can actually say, I have physical evidence of the fact that you lied. Whereas that can be a little harder to do because politicians are great at vague rhetoric.
Right.
That's what they're...
Right.
That is their forte.
Yes.
So this is plain, it's simple, it shows us where they stand. And yeah, we've had some pretty good luck with it so far, and we're working to promote it as best we can. We have an outreach coordinator who's literally calling campaigns from across the nation saying, please sign this pledge. And we've had a lot of great luck and great response from activists too. And we've even had activists who bring a copy of this pledge to the debate and say, will you sign this? And if they say no, well, you know where they stand.
Right.
So.
And I think you bring up a great point when you talk about the primary in Texas, the Cruz-Dewhurst contest.
Right.
Because in a lot of states, the districts are drawn, and this was a statewide race, but think about this as applied on a congressional level.
Yeah, and most of our candidates are congressional candidates
Right.
who've signed.
The districts are drawn so that the primary is the general election, essentially. That's all over the country.
Gerrymandering.
And people complain why this or that congressperson can't be gotten out of office, regardless of how reprehensible they are. It's because they're not designed to be allowed to be thrown out of office. That seat belongs to that party. Now, people need to stop thinking like that, obviously.
Right.
And in the long run, there might be changes. But essentially, since Congress works that way,
Right.
since most seats are of one party or the other, the place to do these challenges, to bring these pledges up, is the primary. Absolutely. Put them on record. Then you have it for well ahead of the general. That was a key point, I think, to me when I was reading this, is how that affects a primary in a state where, or in a district where, that could be the general.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And one of the things that I focus on a lot in my own career and my own political activism is primaries. I've felt for such a long time that primaries are key. You know, you bring up gerrymandering, and it's true. When you talk about the corruption of the political establishment, gerrymandering, which, you know, simply means that they make these districts for themselves, and it's the thing where both parties do it, right?
Yes.
The Democrats look at the Republicans and say, all right, we'll give you this district if you give us this district, so they don't have to fight with each other.
It's mutually assured destruction. If they were, well, and it's also unilateral disarmament. If one decides we're going to attempt to redraw districts and make them actually competitive, or make them actually represent geographic areas, it's the mutually assured destruction is them holding each other, to those districts.
Right.
And unilateral disarmament would be if one party actually decided to try to make it more reflective of a group or a neighborhood or a region. So they think like battle generals as well.
Yeah,
when
they
they're in
really do.
Congress.
And they think about it not in the context of helping people in any way. They think about it in the context of solidifying their own power. And so we just think that measures like this, Reject the Debt Pledge, put a bit of a wedge in that. It at least puts them on the record. One of the things we're in the process of doing is getting a copy of every single one of these pledges that sign and putting that copy up on our website for you to download. So if your congressman signed this pledge and you find that he or she has broken it, go to a town hall and say to them, look what I have a copy of here. Interesting that you broke this, that, and the other promise that you made to your constituents. Because at the end of the day, this is a promise from the congressman to his or her constituents. That's what it is. You know, it's not about the Coalition to Reduce Spending. It's not about any one organization. It's about us giving the activists a tool to really impact both the election and also federal policy. You know, we see this as a guide to good policy. like we've said before, it's not going to happen overnight. But if we can push the debate in this direction and get to the point where we don't have to raise the debt ceiling, where we don't have to borrow, this is a good government policy that we have in front of us, and we hope to make the congressmen realize that this is what they need to work toward. And so, like I said, we've had great feedback. I was very pleased with the feedback from both, Ted Cruz and David Dewhurst, and we've had some independents. We even had a Democrat. This is a nonpartisan issue, and I think that voters get so tied up in the rhetoric of one party or the other and forget that they really kind of work together against us most of the time. That's really what they're doing in D.C.
If they are not doing it consciously, the system is set up in a way in which it benefits them to do that.
Yeah, you're right.
So, I'm not making the accusations. I'm just saying that that's the structure.
That is true. And I tend to think that this pledge creates a good incentive for imperfect people. And by imperfect, I don't mean evil. I truly don't think that anyone who was really evil would get elected. But you're right, the system has incentives that are negative toward the people, and we hope to create incentives that are positive toward the people. One of the issues that happens is you go to D.C., and one of the reasons is really lack of citizen engagement. Yes. You go to D.C., and the only way to get reelected is to get cozy with all the lobbyists. The citizens need to take up the charge and say, actually, we're more important than the lobbyists. So I feel like this needs to happen on the left and the right, regardless of ideology. You're involved with the Tea Party. I've been involved with that movement too. But you need people on the left rising up. There's one example actually here in Texas, in El Paso. We were talking about primaries. In El Paso, Sylvester Reyes is a congressman. And he was defeated in a primary by Beto O'Rourke, a young city councilman from El Paso. I don't know if you know about that, Felicia.
No.
But the Democratic voters said, we've had enough of Sylvester Reyes taking advantage of us. Let's oust him in the primary. And that's a very safe Democratic seat. So I was pleased. I was very, very pleased to see people on the left getting involved and rising up too. This isn't just about, right-wing ideology. This is about holding politicians of every stripe accountable because they all contributed to this.
Absolutely. And the more we talk about debt and the more we talk about unsustainable models of our federal government, et cetera, the more people will have those tools to talk to their congressmen.
Right.
The more they will even filter that down into city and municipalities and state government. And that is a culture change in the long run. And that absolutely has to take place if we're ever going to prevail and turn the ship around.
I know. A lot of this, I think, too, is that there are two different battles here. We were talking about culture. I like to say that there's an intellectual battle and a political battle, and they're obviously related, but they're separate. If intellectually we can get the country to understand that there is a massive problem with our federal debt, only until we do that can we yield changes in policy through politics, and they go hand in hand. If we elect politicians who are serious about this issue, that in turn impacts the intellectual side. But until the country is ready to accept where we are, our politicians are going to keep doing whatever consolidates their power. And because the citizens have not brought this up or taken them to task over it, they have a little more recently, but in a long-term sense, because this hasn't been a focus, the politicians ignore it. And you can't rely on the politicians to talk about it. You have to rely on citizens, and that's what it comes down to.
And here's why. Obviously, there's no farmer at the end of that farm benefit that is not going to support, most of them, that is not going to support that farm subsidy.
Right.
There's no auto company at the end of that bailout that's going to turn that down. Not really. But when you're looking at debt, there's no constituent. It's all of us.
Yeah.
And the squeaky wheel gets the grease really does apply, because a very small constituency can make a lot of noise and put a lot of pressure on a politician. This is a big constituency. Everyone knows it's a problem. Nobody knows what to do about it. It sort of washes over us. But there's been some good messaging in the past. There has. And it would be great to see commercials with babies born and coming out screaming and find out that it's because they just got the bill for their debt, not their hospital stay, but their share of the debt. Things like that.
$50,000 per citizen.
Or people that are, the government people turning kids upside down for their lunch money, in that whole generational theft sort of thing.
Yeah.
Images like that are powerful. And the more that we put forth effort into explaining things in those terms, I think that kind of hits the cultural battle, but it hits the intellectual and political battles as well.
You are totally right, Felicia. And like I said, the Coalition to Reduce Spending is a newer organization, but those types of things are exactly what we hope to be able to produce as we grow. Because there's something to say of imagery. I think that really, really impacts people's understanding. And, you know, we mentioned before Learn, Liberty, Reason, those groups. I would love to have the Coalition to Reduce Spending produce similar types of things to put out there, because it's so crucial. There's also a great video I saw that we tweeted and Facebooked the other day at the Coalition to Reduce Spending. It is a video in which they narrow down, you know, basically the extent of what is unfunded liabilities, et cetera, our debt on a federal level. They basically round it down to an individual man, and they show a man walking into his bank, going up to his, you know, broker and saying, I need to raise my debt ceiling. And, you know, they show on a much smaller scale the fact that this is just absurd. Like, imagine a person, imagine an individual behaving the way the federal government does. Again, it's a tragedy of the commons thing. When there's a bunch of people in Congress and you can't nail down exactly whose fault it is, it's easier to get away with things like this. But putting it in the context of one individual shows how utterly absurd this really, really is.
And people know that intuitively.
They do.
People know in their own budget, in their own life, in their own business, they know these things.
Yeah.
They cannot get their heads around the magnitude of how big and bad this is, because it's anathema. How can you think in numbers that big?
You can't. And that's why you can't. And that's why I love that video where they round it down to what this would be for an individual. And I don't recall the exact numbers, but I remember he's something like several, I want to say almost 100,000 in debt, something to that degree. And he's like, well, I cut $380 out of my budget. You know, that was totally crazy. Right. Kind of playing on how the politicians talk about this issue, where they say, oh, wow, that cut to, you know, projected spending, which isn't even really a cut because we haven't spent the money yet, that was just so crazy. You know, and that's another issue, an entirely different issue that people don't understand, baseline budgeting, where spending automatically goes up, and politicians claim that they're cutting spending when they're just saying, oh, we won't spend as much as we initially intended to. Great video online of Paul Ryan talking about covering the moon with yogurt. I don't think I've seen that. It'll cost $14 trillion to do that. We'll pass that bill today, then we'll decide not to pass that, or we'll rescind that bill tomorrow, and we've just saved $14 trillion. Exactly. They do wonderful gymnastics like that in Washington. They do. That's what they're so good at. And the thing is that, again, this is what the Republicans and Democrats, with a few exceptions, are good at doing together, is say, wow, those cuts were crazy, even though they weren't real cuts. And the public thinks, oh, wow, those cuts must have been crazy. But they never are intellectually honest about the practice of baseline budgeting. And it's very, very scary. That would be like me saying to my fiance, you know, oh, next year we're going to buy a hot tub and a new house and a bike. And, you know, okay, great. You know, that's $100,000 or whatever. And then I say, okay, we're not going to buy the hot tub, and then I claim that we cut $1,000. Yes. Yes. But I didn't cut anything. I'm talking about it. It's theoretical. Again, when you drill it down to one person, you see how absurd it is. But this is what these politicians do. And not to mention the fact they haven't passed a budget in 3 years, which is technically illegal. Well, and you know, that brings up a great point. Joe Biden the other day talking about his father, and his father said that show me your budget, right, and I will tell you what you value. You look at the payments of the things that we're making. We value paying people off. We value our military, we do, right, and we value a couple of other things really a lot, right, but they're high on the priority. But mostly we value shifting money around in this country. That's what we're doing. I know. And it's very scary when you look at not only the baseline budgeting, but the fact that they simply have not passed a budget in 3 years. I mean, I believe the fiscal year is supposed to start in October. So when Congress comes back in session, you know, after Labor Day, when they're back, Allegedly, they're going to be working on a budget, but the problem is the past 3 years, they haven't. I mean, yes, there have been budget proposals, and a lot of budget proposals have passed the House, but nothing has passed the Senate, and nothing has been signed into law. And the Constitution is pretty clear about, you know, these issues and that Congress is supposed to control spending, yet we don't see any of that. And this speaks to the level of your responsibility. And it's not even that Congress or the president even normally stick to the budgets. They didn't in the past, but the fact that we don't even have one passed, or we haven't in several years, that just speaks to how crazy things are. And again, this is something average voters don't understand because the politicians and the media aren't talking about it. And they aren't talking about it because they're trying to protect their own interests. Unfortunately, it's at the expense of people like you and I and the program, you know, program viewers tonight.
It's very difficult, too, to figure out all the things that go on in Washington, all the games that they play. I really ought to start keeping track of some of the little, the little games that they use, little rhetorical flourishes that they get on. I really need to start blogging about that or something. But it's almost too much to follow. It is no wonder that the average person doesn't want to have anything to do with politics, because when they start looking, they get so disgusted, they throw up their hands and leave.
No, I know. It's completely crazy. If I didn't work in politics, I would not have any idea about this. And I feel like I still only understand probably about 20% at best. Truly.
You're doing far better than I.
Truly. I mean, that's being really, really generous to myself, too. It's so insane that I don't even know how anybody could follow it. I really, really don't.
You know what really moved me, though? In 2009, over the whole health care debate, people were going to those town halls and confronting their congressmen with the Constitution in their hand, and they could quote from it.
That was pretty
That
cool.
was hopeful. That was incredibly hopeful to me. And even when we had a town hall last year talking about the raising the debt ceiling with one of our congressmen, the question came up, and I was the one who asked it because I'm mean like that. The question came up, exactly what budget items are going to have less dollars, actual dollars, going into that budget item than did before because of the cuts?
Was there an answer?
Not a single item. So that goes back to your whole zero-based budgeting.
Right.
And going back to they don't even want to talk about that.
No, they don't.
And this was a Republican, conservative, ostensibly fiscally responsible congressman.
Yeah, that's part of the problem. Like we said, it's bipartisan, and it's pretty scary if a allegedly conservative congressman from Houston won't even talk about it. But it's one of those things that, again, it needs to come from the citizens. The more people like you and others go and pressure them, the more they'll realize you're creating an incentive that shows them they need to address these matters if they're going to get reelected. And that's what it comes down to. Politicians care about one thing. They care about getting reelected. That's why we pressure them into signing the Reject the Debt Pledge during their primary or whenever they want to sign it. Someone in office is more than welcome to sign it right now, but politically, let's be honest, the primary is the time that they're most likely to. Get them to sign the Reject the Debt Pledge, and then they've signed it. Well, what now? They go to D.C., they do all the things that they do, and essentially, now at least, activists are one step closer to, you know, crafting that pressure that you've obviously been highly involved in putting out there. And it's about incentives. It's about incentives for politics, about incentives for power. If politicians realize that the only way to stay in power is to reduce federal spending, that's when they'll finally do it. Thus far, what they've come to know politically is that the best way to stay in power is to increase spending. It's got to come down to the average citizen saying enough is enough. It's got to come down to men like that person who called and says, I know people who can't even pay their rent. How are they supposed to deal with this federal debt? People like him need to speak up. He may not have any idea how the federal budgeting system works. I don't even know. It's too complicated. Right. But he knows in his heart that something is not right, and he needs to tell his congressman. That's the only way things are going to change.
And, you know, you brought up a point. They care about one thing, and that's getting reelected. Yeah. And there's only two ways to really move a congressman. You deliver votes, or you deliver money. And most of us don't have money. So getting together in groups and actually showing up in force in a congressman's office is a thing that will scare them. We've seen Tea Party groups and other liberty groups go to congressman's office and actually attempt to have that conversation with the staff or with him himself, have a meeting, invite him to come speak, whatever. That moves them.
Yeah.
When they can put a face or a sea of faces to an actual issue and say, oh my stars, I've got something I've got to deal with, or they're going to vote me out.
Especially if said faces, like you said, vote.
Yes.
That's the key. Especially if said faces vote, or if said faces will promote you, right? You know, people talk about the alleged, you know, Ted Cruz is a Tea Party candidate. It's hard to say that any one candidate's a Tea Party candidate,
Right.
I think. But that was obviously the media narrative, and I think to an extent true. But that was one of the reasons that I think Ted Cruz was able to overcome, you know, the sitting lieutenant governor, because activists were promoting him because he did things like sign this reject the debt pledge, and he did things like, you know, say he understands these issues, and from what I know of Ted, he seems to. We'll have to see what happens, you know, if
Right.
he gets elected in November. But these are the things, you know, activists matter. Activists deliver votes, and so
Yes.
I think things like these primaries, when you know, the more like establishment's not even the right word, but the candidates people expect to win, or the candidates who have traditionally won in the past, when those candidates are no longer a shoo-in, that creates incentives for people to change. And the Reject the Debt Pledge is one of those tools, but simply activism. Activism is one of those tools. Go in, scare them, scare the living daylights out of them. That's what needs to be done.
You show up with 20 people in their congressional office in Washington, that becomes a big deal.
It does.
I've seen it, I've been there, I've done it.
Yeah,
It's
me too.
beautiful to see the look on the staff's faces, the look on the congressman's faces when you walk in with an issue and you are very clear on what you're asking for. One issue at a time, you can do this. Anyone can do this.
Yep.
Any phone calls, showing up, bringing a group with you. Melt the phones was a thing in 2009. We kept calling and calling and calling over certain issues, specifically health care.
Right.
And it turned a lot of people really to listen to what the voters were saying. It's doable. It has to be done. And anyone can do it.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, over at townhall.com, which is kind of an opinion website, a man by the name of Paul Jacob, he used to run an organization called Citizens in Charge. That organization focused on, you know, citizen engagement and whatnot, but something that Paul wrote, he mentioned our Reject the Debt Pledge as being one of the tools, but what Paul said struck me. He said that, and it's what we've been talking about, that it matters who we elect, of course, that does matter, but what matters more is how the citizens engage with that elected official. And that speaks to exactly what you're saying. If citizens aren't serious about the debt, politicians won't be serious about the debt. So it comes down to us. You know, people talk about how we have a democracy in this country, you know, constitutional republic, however you want to phrase it, but it is a government allegedly of the people. And we need to remember that. We have more power than we think. And I feel like things like this Reject the Debt Pledge and what we're doing with the Coalition to Reduce Spending, what activist groups, be they the Tea Party or other similar organizations on the left, this is a transpartisan matter. Political engagement, you have to do it no matter what your ideology is, because everyone is being hurt by this. No matter how you think we have to deal with this issue, you need to engage on it.
When you said we have more power than we know, that's so important. People don't forget that they're not going to let you know that you have the power.
They won't. They don't want you to know. And that being said, we're wrapping up here, but thank you so much, Felicia, for joining.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been really great. I highly suggest that everybody check out, again, it's reducespending.org. And please engage with us on social media. We're at twitter.com/reduce_spending. And we're at facebook.com/reducespending. And Felicia, tell everyone here how they can get involved locally in Houston with your organization.
HoustonTPS.org is our website. And I'm always available on Twitter at somethingfishy, F-I-S-H-I-E at the end. Easy to find.
Yes, and I'm also available on Twitter at twitter.com/Corie Whalen. That's CORIE. WHALEN, and we're happy to engage with you and facilitate more conversation and talk about resources that you can use to help other people understand just how crucial our national debt really is, because that's what needs to happen. People who are not typically politically engaged need to see these numbers. They need to realize that this is impacting not only them, but their family, and most specifically, it's impacting their children. That's something that really matters, and an emotional appeal that has a lot of power. Show people those numbers. It's about their future and about this country's prosperity, and it affects every single American. So Thank you, Felicia, and it was great to talk to everyone tonight, and hopefully we'll be able to come and talk about this some other time as well.